not to a military base, not to a war room. It came to a small office on the 14th floor of the United Earth Diplomatic Building in Geneva, where Delegate Ava Reed was eating a sandwich over a stack of trade reports and wondering if she had enough time to finish both before her next meeting. She read the message twice. Then she set down her sandwich, wiped her hands, and read it a third time. The Galactic Council was requesting human presence at a peace summit. 3 alien civilizations had been grinding against each other for decades: the Vithari, the Draenei, and the Solon Collective. Skirmishes at borders, trade route blockades, cold tension that everyone could feel but nobody wanted to formally call a war. The Council had finally decided to intervene and wanted humanity to sit at the table as neutral mediators. Ava told her assistant to clear her schedule for the next 6 weeks. She spent those 6 weeks not packing, not preparing speeches, but reading. Everything. Every trade dispute, every border incident, every recorded statement made by every faction going back 40 years. She brought in 3 analysts, 2 economists, and 1 very tired cartographer who spent 2 weeks making sure every map in her proposal was accurate down to the patrol kilometer. When the human delegation boarded the shuttle to Station Accord, Ava Reed carried with her a proposal that was 412 pages long and had solutions for problems the alien factions had not even publicly admitted they had yet. Station Accord was large. That was the first thing anyone noticed. It hung in open space like something that had always been there: silver-white panels catching distant starlight, wide viewports glowing soft blue. Alien vessels of 3 different designs were already docked, each one bigger and more elaborate than the human shuttle that eased in beside them like a practical shoe next to 3 chandeliers. Subcommander Wen Tao, standing just behind Ava as they walked through the docking corridor, said nothing. He had a habit of noticing things without commenting on them. He noticed the way the Vithari delegation's honor guard was positioned, facing outward, toward the Draenei docking bay, not inward toward a guest. He noticed the council staff who greeted the humans were junior aides, not senior officials. He noticed the room they were given was on a lower level than the Vithari suite. He said nothing. He filed it away. The first session began the following morning in the council chamber, a wide circular room with a domed ceiling that projected live star maps above the table. The effect was meant to be grand. It was. Ava sat across from Councillor Bren of the Vithari and Councillor Yas of the Draenei, with Solon observers seated in the upper tier behind thick glass, as they always were. Ava opened by presenting a summary of her proposal, just the summary, because the full document had been sent to all parties the night before. She spoke clearly, without rushing. She pointed to specific corridor agreements, resource-sharing frameworks, and a joint monitoring system that would remove the need for any faction to trust the others blindly. Bren listened, or appeared to listen. When she finished, he thanked her with the particular warmth that carries no actual heat and said that humanity's perspective was, quote, a welcome addition to the room. Not to the conversation, to the room. Yas said nothing. He was watching Bren. The session continued. Within the first hour, Ava noticed that the back and forth between Bren and the Draenei representative was pulling away from the framework she had laid out. By the second hour, they were negotiating details that her proposal had already resolved, as if it had not been read. By the third hour, Bren made a comment about routing rights that directly contradicted a solution on page 67 of the document he had received 12 hours ago. Ava asked politely if Councillor Bren had reviewed the full proposal. Bren said that he had reviewed the relevant sections. She asked which sections he considered relevant. There was a pause. Then Bren said, with the tone of a person explaining something to someone who ought to already know it, that humanity's role here was to provide a stabilizing presence, not to drive the direction of negotiations. He said it was appreciated. He said the proposal was thorough. He said it was not, however, the right moment to introduce outside frameworks when the primary parties were finding their rhythm. Outside frameworks. Ava looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with the expression of a person who has just confirmed something they already knew. She looked at Wen Tao. He gave the smallest nod. She gathered her documents. Not quickly, not with drama, she stacked them the way she always stacked them, edges aligned, corners even. She stood. She thanked Counselor Bren for clarifying the situation. She thanked Counselor Yas for his time. She walked to the chamber door and Wen Tao walked with her, one step behind and to the left, the same as always. The chamber went silent in the way that rooms go silent when something happens that nobody prepared for. The door closed behind them, not slammed, just closed. Bren looked at the door, then at Yas, then at the door again. He said they would return. He said it like he believed it. Yas did not say anything. He was looking at the stack of documents Ava had left in the center of the table, every page in order, nothing missing, nothing damaged. Left there like something that had been offered and refused. In the corridor outside, Ava Reed walked at her usual pace, documents under her arm, eyes forward. Wen Tao beside her now finally spoke. He said, "Do we call Ostrov?" She said, "He already knows. Nobody told the supply corridor to keep running. It just did because someone was maintaining it." That someone was a rotation of 14 human technicians who operated 3 relay stations along the Vithari Eastern trade route. They had been there for 9 months, doing calibrations, filing interference reports, patching signal drift. The Vithari did not know their names. The council had never asked for them. They appeared in no diplomatic file because no one had thought to mention them, the same way no one mentions the people who keep the lights on until the lights go off. On the second day after the walkout, Director Hal Ostrov sent each of them the same message. Standard rotation complete. Return to home station. Well done. They packed their equipment in the order it had been unpacked. They filed their final maintenance logs. They left the relay stations clean, powered to standby mode and locked. The corridor did not immediately fail. It took 4 days. On Station Accord, the council spent those 4 days waiting for Ava Reed to come back. Bren sent a junior aide to the human quarters on the first evening. The aide returned and reported that the quarters were empty and tidy and that there was a note on the table. Bren read the note. It said, "We came to help, the offer stands, you know where to find us." He put it down and said they were bluffing. Yas picked up the note and read it again. He did not say they were bluffing. He did not say anything. He folded the note carefully and put it in his inner coat pocket, which was a thing he did only with documents he expected to need again. Ambassador Leo Fenn, the youngest member of the Drenai delegation, spent the first 2 days writing routine reports. On the 3rd day, he started checking the human diplomatic record not because anyone asked him to, but because something was bothering him and he could not name it yet. He pulled their travel logs first. The human shuttle had not left. It was still docked. That meant they were somewhere on the station or somewhere nearby. He cross-referenced with station traffic and found that 2 human crew members had moved through the commercial sectors, bought food, and returned to the shuttle without speaking to anyone. Not hiding, not demonstrating, just waiting. He flagged it in a note to Yas, who read it and said, "Keep watching." On the 4th day, a Vithari cargo convoy moving through the eastern trade route lost signal contact with the second relay station. The convoy captain switched to backup navigation, which worked for about 6 hours before the interference reports the relay station had been suppressing for 9 months started coming through all at once. The convoy slowed. The captain sent a distress advisory, not an emergency, just a notice that navigation was degraded and they were proceeding with caution. Then the Drenai skirmish debris hit them. It was old debris. It had been sitting in a drift pattern along that corridor for 3 months. The relay station had been logging it, flagging it, and routing convoys around it as a matter of routine. Without the relay station, nobody had flagged it because nobody had been looking. 2 ships took damage. Not catastrophic damage, hull stress. 1 engine unit lost on the smaller freighter, some cargo containers breached. 4 crew members injured, none killed. The convoy pulled back to a Vithari way station and sent a full incident report to the council. Bren received the incident report and went very quiet. Yas received it separately and went looking for Leo Fen. He found the ambassador in the archive room, which was where Leo had been spending most of his time. Yas asked him what he had found. Leo pulled up 3 things: the relay station maintenance logs, the corridor incident history, and a shipping traffic comparison from the past 9 months versus the past 4 days. In 9 months, 0 corridor incidents. In 4 days, 1. The only variable was the presence of the human technicians. Yas sat down. Leo said, "I think we should ask what else they were maintaining." Yas said, "I already sent the request to the council archives. We are waiting for access clearance." Leo said, "How long for clearance?" Yas said, "Normally 2 weeks." Then he paused and said, "I am going to ask for emergency authorization." On the human shuttle, Ava Reed was drinking tea and reading a book she had not had time to finish in 4 years. Wen Tao was going through navigation charts, not because they needed them, but because it was what he did when he was waiting. It was how you could tell he was paying attention. He got quieter and more organized. He said, without looking up, "They found the relay station incident." She turned a page and said, "Yes." He said, "Bren will try to frame it as negligence, abandonment of duty." She said, "He can try." Wen Tao was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yas took the note." She looked up from her book. He said, "The AIDS report mentioned it. Yas put it in his coat." She considered that and went back to her book. Outside, through the shuttle's small viewport, Station Accord floated in the dark. Its lights were on. Its corridors were busy. Everything looked exactly as it had before. But 4 days ago, 14 people had packed their equipment and gone home. And something that had been held up quietly, without ceremony, without credit, had started to come down. The emergency archive clearance took 11 hours instead of 2 weeks, which told Leo Fen something important about how worried the council suddenly was. He stayed in the archive room through the night. He had a habit of working better when the corridors were empty, and the ambient hum of the station dropped to something almost like silence. He brewed himself something warm from the machine in the corner, pulled up the cleared files, and started reading. The first file was a routine human logistics report from 8 months ago. Standard maintenance, standard language, nothing dramatic. But inside it was a subsection titled Corridor Environmental Data, and inside that was something that stopped him cold. The relay stations had not just been fixing signal drift. They had been monitoring atmospheric microdebris, gravitational lane shifts, and biohazard trace particles along 4 separate routes, 2 Vithari, 1 Drenai, 1 Solon. They had been filing those readings every 72 hours, not because anyone asked, not because it was in their contract. A note at the bottom of the section, written in plain human language, said, "These readings are outside our technical scope but may be relevant to safe transit, so we are including them." Outside our technical scope but may be relevant. Leo sat with that for a while. He kept reading. By the 3rd file, he found the corridor mapping project, something the human technicians had started on their own, tracking debris drift patterns across 6 months and producing updated navigation recommendations. The recommendations had been sent to the Council Logistics Office. He checked the Council Logistics Office records. The recommendations had been received, filed, and never acted on. By the 5th file, he found the biological trace data. One of the Solon transit routes had been showing low-level contamination markers. Not dangerous, not immediately, but the kind of thing that builds up over years and becomes a problem. The human team had flagged it twice, sent a formal report with a mitigation recommendation, and then, when no response came, had begun quietly implementing the mitigation on their own, documenting every step. They had been cleaning up a slow-moving health risk on a Solon trade route for 4 months. The Solon Collective did not know. The Council did not know. Nobody knew except the 14 humans who had decided, without being asked, that it needed to be done. Leo read that section 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. He brought everything to Yas at first light. He laid the files out on the table, not summarized, not filtered, just laid out, and let Yas read them in silence. Yas read slowly. He was the kind of person who never skimmed, which usually made meetings with him very long but also meant he never missed anything. He got to the Solon contamination section and stopped. He asked, "They did this without being asked?" Leo said, "Yes." He asked, "Without being paid for it?" Leo said, "It was outside the contract scope, yes." Yas folded his hands on the table and looked at the wall. Bren came in during this. He had been told about the archive clearance and assumed it would support his position that the human walkout was an irresponsible disruption of critical infrastructure. He picked up the first file, read 2 pages, and put it down. He said, "This is all routine work. They were doing their jobs." Yas said, "They were doing someone else's job too." Bren said that the point was the humans had abandoned their post, and that regardless of what they had been doing before, the walkout was a violation of the diplomatic agreement. Yas asked him to point to the clause in the diplomatic agreement that required the human delegation to stay at the table after being publicly dismissed. Bren said that was not the point. Yas said, "Then what is the point?" There was a pause, a long one. Bren said that the council needed to issue a formal statement of concern regarding the human withdrawal, and that Reed's delegation should be summoned back officially, as a matter of protocol. He drafted the message himself. It was formal, precise, and carried underneath its careful language a tone that assumed the humans had been mildly unreasonable and were expected to recognize that. The message went to the human shuttle. On the shuttle, Wen Tao read it aloud once in a flat voice. Then he looked at Ava. She was looking out the viewport at nothing in particular. She said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think Yas wrote the last paragraph." She said, "I think so too." She drafted her reply. It took 4 minutes. She sent it. On Station Accord, the reply arrived in Bren's message queue. He opened it. 3 sentences. She was willing to return. Her original proposal remained unchanged. The council was welcome to review it at their convenience. Bren read it twice and said it was a non-answer. Yas read it and said, "It is the same answer she gave the first time before we stopped listening." He stood up from the table. He told Leo to prepare a full briefing document, everything from the archive, organized and clear. He told Bren that when the council convened tomorrow, he intended to raise the question of what exactly they thought they had been managing these past 9 months. Bren asked what that was supposed to mean. Yas picked up his copy of the note, the one from the empty human quarters, still folded, still in his coat, and set it on the table between them. He said, "It means I want to know how much we have been depending on people we decided were not important enough to listen to." He walked out. The note stayed on the table. Bren looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Leo, who was already gathering the archive files. Leo did not meet his eyes. He kept filing. The briefing that Yas called was supposed to last 1 hour. It lasted 4. Leo Fen presented the archive data the way he had been trained to present things, methodically, without editorializing, letting the facts carry their own weight. He had organized everything into a single continuous record. What the human team had been doing when they had been doing it, what they had flagged, what had been ignored, and what had quietly continued to function because of work that nobody had authorized and nobody had thanked. 14 technicians, 9 months, 4 routes, 3 civilizations including their own kept slightly safer than they would otherwise have been. About 40 minutes into the presentation, one of the Vithari logistics officials raised her hand and asked Leo to go back to the slide showing the debris drift mapping. Leo went back. The official looked at it for a long time. She asked if the humans had shared this mapping with the Vithari Route Authority. Leo said they had sent it to the Council Logistics Office 11 weeks ago. The official looked at Bren. Bren looked at the table. She asked, and the Route Authority received nothing. Bren said there had been a filing backlog, and the report had not yet been forwarded. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when something deeply inconvenient has just been said out loud. Leo moved on. By the second hour, they had reached the Solon contamination data. A Solon observer, one of the 3 who always sat behind glass in the upper tier, asked for the session to pause. The 3 of them conferred for a long time. When they came back, the lead observer asked for a full copy of the human biological trace reports, everything, going back to the beginning. Leo said he would arrange it. The observer said, "We had no idea this work was being done." Leo said, "Neither did we until yesterday." Bren tried twice to steer the conversation back toward the question of the walkout and whether it constituted a breach of the summit agreement. Both times, Yas redirected him, not aggressively, just with the steady persistence of someone who has decided what the real subject of the meeting is and is not interested in changing it. By the third hour, they were looking at something no one had thought to look for before. A comparison map showing all the quiet human activity across the region in the past 9 months, plotted against every incident that had and had not occurred. The incidents that had not occurred were the important part. There were 17 of them. Near misses, contamination events, navigation failures, debris collisions, things that had not happened because someone had noticed them coming and acted without being asked. 16 of them were directly tied to human monitoring and intervention. The 17th was a disputed border skirmish between the Vithari and Drenai that had been de-escalated by a human liaison officer making an informal call to both sides before it was ever formally reported. An informal call, not on record, not in any file. Leo had found it only because the human liaison had written it up in his own shift notes as a personal log, the way some people write down things that happen not because anyone will read it, but because they want a record for themselves. When that slide came up, Bren did not say anything. Yas asked Leo to leave it on the screen for a moment. The room stayed there looking at it. 17 things that had not happened, rendered in a simple chart, clean lines, no dramatic formatting, because the humans who made it did not seem to feel the need to make their work look impressive. It either was what it was or it was not. After the briefing, Bren went back to his suite and did not attend the informal session that followed. Yas sat with Leo and 3 council officials and talked for another hour, not about the summit, about structure, about who had actually been doing what and for how long and what that meant going forward. One of the officials asked, "How did we not know about any of this?" Yas said, "Because we did not ask, and because they did not feel the need to announce it." The official said, "Why would they do all of this without telling anyone?" Leo said quietly that he had been thinking about that question since the night before, and his best answer was that it seemed to simply be how they operated. They saw something that needed doing. They did it. They documented it in case someone wanted to know. They did not wait to be recognized for it because recognition did not appear to be the point. The official looked at the chart still on the screen. She said, "And then we told them their input was not required." Nobody responded to that. On the human shuttle, when Tao received a short message from an analyst back home, it was a logistics summary, Nothing sensitive, just a rundown of how the reassigned maintenance teams were being deployed now that the corridor rotations were done. The analyst had added a note at the bottom that said, "Everything is proceeding normally. Let us know if anything changes." He showed it to Ava. She read it, she nodded, she handed it back. He said, "They will call tomorrow." She said, "Probably." He said, "What do we ask for?" She said, "Nothing they are not already going to offer." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You think Yas is there yet?" She thought about it. She said, "I think Yas was there before we left the room." Outside, the station ran its lights on schedule. The docking corridor was quiet. The stars did not move. Somewhere in an archive room, 17 blank spaces on a chart sat still on a screen that someone had forgotten to turn off. Yas wrote the message himself. He did not ask a staff member to draft it. He did not run it by Bren. He sat at the small desk in his quarters at the end of a very long day and wrote it the way someone writes something they want to get right. It was not long. It acknowledged the dismissal that had occurred in the chamber. It did not call it a misunderstanding. It called it what it was, a failure to treat the human delegation with the seriousness their preparation deserved. It said that Counselor Yas, in his capacity as second seat, was formally requesting the human delegation return to the table, not as a symbolic presence, as a working partner. He read it twice. Then he sent it before he could revise it into something softer. The reply came in 20 minutes. "Yes, same terms as the original proposal. Ready when you are." He sat with that for a moment. 20 minutes. She had been waiting for this and still took 20 minutes, not to consider, he suspected, but to make clear she was not sitting by the door with her hand on the handle. He went to find Bren. He found him in the viewing lounge, which was the room with the largest viewports on this level, looking out at nothing in particular. It was a thing Bren did when he was working through something. Yas sat down across from him and did not say anything for a while. Bren said eventually, "You already contacted them?" Yas said, "Yes." Bren said, "You should have brought it to a full council vote." Yas said, "I should have, I did not." Bren looked at him. Yas looked back. There was a long history between the two of them, long enough that neither of them needed to say the full version of most things. Bren said, "What exactly are we walking back into? If her proposal is still the same, nothing has changed." Yas said, "We have changed." Bren was quiet. Yas said, "The proposal was right the first time. We did not read it properly because we had already decided who was presenting it. That is what changed. We read it properly now." Bren turned back to the viewport. He said, "She is going to know all of this. She is going to walk in knowing she was right." Yas said, "She knew she was right when she walked out." There was another silence. Bren said, "Will she say so?" Yas said no. He stood up and left Bren with the viewports. The next morning, the human shuttle's dock connection registered as active. Ava Reed and Wen Tao walked through the corridor without ceremony, no formal receiving line, no delegation waiting, just two people moving through a station that had seen them before. Leo Fen met them at the junction to the main level. He had not been asked to. He had gotten up early and positioned himself there because he wanted to see her face when she arrived. She looked the same as the day she had left, unhurried, documents under one arm. Leo said, "Welcome back, Delegate Reed." She said, "Thank you, Ambassador Fen. Did you get any sleep?" He said, "Some." She said, "The archive work was yours." He said, "Most of it." She nodded. She said, "It was thorough." He fell into step beside them. He had approximately 40 things he wanted to say and managed to say none of them because they had arrived at the chamber door and it was opening. Inside, the table was the same circular table. The star maps were the same on the ceiling, but the arrangement was different. Yas was already seated, not at the traditional head position but closer to center, which was where someone sits when they want to signal they are not running the room alone. There were new chairs placed for the human delegation, not at the side, not at the foot, but across from Yas in a position of actual equivalence. Bren was present. He nodded at Ava. She nodded back. Nothing further was required. Ava set her documents on the table. The same documents, the same 412 pages that had been on this table once before. Nobody made a comment about that. Yas said, "We have reviewed the proposal in full. We believe it is a workable foundation. We would like to go through it section by section, starting with the corridor agreements." Ava said, "The corridor section begins on page 12. And that was how it started, not with a speech. Not with an apology formalized into procedural language, just page 12. They worked through the morning. The Vithari logistics official from the day before attended and participated directly, which was irregular for a non-delegate but which nobody challenged. The Solon observers behind the glass were all three present and were, for the first time, taking visible notes. At one point, midway through the resource-sharing framework, Bren stopped the discussion. He asked a question about the Joint Monitoring Clause, specifically the provision that gave each party access to monitoring data from corridors they did not operate. It was the kind of question that could have been asked defensively, the way someone asks a question to find a problem. But he did not ask it that way. He asked it like someone trying to understand the mechanism. Ava explained the mechanism. She had designed it herself. She explained it plainly, without the particular patience people use when they think they are being condescending. Just information, directly given. Bren nodded. He made a note. Leo, sitting at the edge of the room with no formal seat at the table, watched this and thought, "There it is." Not the agreement, not even the progress. Just that small thing, a question asked plainly and answered the same way, between people who were finally in the same conversation. Outside the viewport, the station turned slowly in its orbit, the way it always did. The stars did not move. The corridor relay stations were still offline, still waiting, but the map on page 67 of a 400-page document was open on the table now. And everyone in the room was looking at it. The agreement took 9 more days to finalize. Not because the framework was wrong, it was not, but because every clause that had been settled had to be tested against objections from parties who had spent decades defending their positions, and were not yet sure it was safe to stop. Old habits of suspicion do not disappear because someone puts a good proposal on the table. They have to be walked through, examined, and released slowly, like pressure from a sealed container. Ava Reed understood this. She did not push. She moved at the pace the room could hold, which was different every day and required reading the temperature of the chamber every morning before deciding what to cover next. On the days Bren was closed, she worked the Solon sections. On the days the Vithari logistics official was present, she went deep into the corridor data because the official had a technical mind and liked specifics. Wen Tao sat in the room through all of it. He had no formal role in the sessions. Nobody had questioned his presence and nobody was going to, because he had the quality of someone who is so consistently useful that removing him would feel like a disruption. He tracked everything, timings, side conversations, the small shifts in body language that said one party was close to a concession before they said it out loud. He passed notes to Ava on folded paper, which was an old habit from training that they had kept because it left no electronic record and required no device. On the 6th day, the Solon observers asked to move from behind their glass partition and join the table directly. This was, as Leo later wrote in his council report, a thing that had not happened in 31 years of Solon participation in council summits. They always observed. They had conditions and preferences and a deeply ingrained institutional caution about being in the same physical space as negotiating parties. They came out of their booth and sat down, and the room absorbed this without drama, which was itself a small, extraordinary thing. The lead Solon observer, whose name translated approximately to something like Warden of the Third Route. They used titles, not personal names, in formal settings, sat directly across from the Vithari logistics official. They had a 4-hour conversation about contamination monitoring standards that was, by all accounts from those present, extremely technical and extremely productive. Ava sat at the side of that conversation and said very little. She had already written the monitoring framework. It was working without her. On the 8th day, Bren came to her. Not in the chamber. In the corridor outside, in the late afternoon when the session had broken early because the Drenai delegation needed to consult with their home government on a specific clause. He fell into step beside her, or as close to it as his longer gait allowed, and they walked without speaking for a moment. He said, "I want to ask you something, as a private matter." She said, "All right." He said, "When you left the chamber, the first time, did you know it would come to this?" She thought about it. She gave him the honest answer, which was, "I knew something would have to change for the talks to work. I did not know exactly what." He said, "But you were not surprised by what we found in the archive?" She said, "No." He asked why. She said, "Because our people knew what they were doing and they documented it carefully. I had read their reports before I came here. The archive was always available. We simply did not know if anyone would look." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "We would not have. If the convoy had not been hit, we would not have looked." She said, "Probably not." He said, "That is a difficult thing to acknowledge." She said, "Yes, but you acknowledged it." He looked at her. He said, "Is that enough?" She did not answer immediately. They had reached the junction where the corridor split, her way toward the docking level, his toward the council residential wing. She stopped and looked at him. She said, "It is a start. Whether it is enough depends on what comes after." He nodded. He went his way, she went hers. On the 9th day, the agreement was signed. The ceremony was modest by council standards. No public broadcast, no formal speeches. Yas had suggested that, and nobody had objected. Just the parties, their delegates, a table with the final document open, and the star maps slowly rotating above them in the dome. Bren signed for the Vithari. The Drenai delegate signed beside him. The Solon warden of the Third Route pressed a formal seal rather than a signature, which was their custom. Yas signed as council witness. Ava Reed signed last, on behalf of the human delegation. When it was done, nobody cheered. The room had a particular kind of quiet that comes when something that should have happened earlier has finally happened. Not celebration. Relief, maybe. The kind that takes a moment to recognize. Leo Fenn stood near the back and watched. He had been compiling his report for 6 days already, writing a little each evening after sessions. The final section, which he had been avoiding because he was not sure how to say it correctly, was about what the archive data actually revealed, not just the technical work, but what it implied about how the human delegation had approached their role from the beginning. He wrote it that night, after the signing, in the small archive room that had become his thinking space over these 2 weeks. He wrote that the humans had arrived with a complete solution. They had been turned away from the conversation. They had left without anger and without announcement. They had taken with them the quiet architecture of work that nobody had noticed was holding the region steady. They had not used this as leverage. They had not threatened or bargained with it. They had simply waited, and the absence had spoken for itself. He wrote, "The thing that is hardest to explain, and perhaps most important to understand, is that none of this appears to have been strategic. There is no evidence that Delegate Reed or Director Ostroff calculated the withdrawal as a pressure mechanism. The humans left because staying was pointless. The consequences were not a plan. They were just what happened when the people doing the work stopped doing it." He paused for a long time over the last line of the report. He wrote, "They never asked to be noticed. They asked to be heard. There is a difference, and we did not understand it until we had spent 9 days reading the records of people who had simply gotten on with it. He filed the report. He closed the archive terminal. He sat in the room for a while longer, thinking about nothing in particular. Down in the docking bay, the human shuttle began its departure sequence. It moved out of the dock slowly, as it had arrived, practical, quiet, unremarkable beside the larger vessels still moored around it. Through the bay viewport, Leo watched it go. It did not look like much, it never had. That, he was beginning to understand, was somewhat the point.